Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that begins not with fame, fortune, or fireworks, but with silence. Picture this. A young man in a dim Paris studio staring at a blank canvas so long that even the dust motes seem to freeze mid-air. Outside, the city hums with life, trains whistle, cafes spill laughter. But inside, Georges Seurat is plotting something no one has ever seen before. What if, he wonders, a painting could be built from pure colour, not strokes, not shapes, just dots? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this little constellation of night owls from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all began in Paris, the late 1800s, the city of gas lamps, glitter, and gossip. Impressionism was the rage. Painters were chasing light across fields and rivers, trying to capture the shimmer of a single moment before it vanished. The art world was vibrant, emotional, even a little reckless. But amid this chaos of colour, one quiet figure stood apart. Georges Seurat. He was the kind of person who'd rather measure a rainbow than run through it. While Monet was out painting the air itself, Seurat sat at home thinking, what if colour could obey rules? It sounds unromantic, right? But that thought, cold, scientific, almost arrogant, would give birth to something astonishing. Pointillism. A way of painting so precise it bordered on madness. He wasn't born a revolutionary. Seurat came from a comfortable Parisian family. A father who was a stiff, practical man, and a mother who loved the arts but never quite understood her son's intensity. As a boy, he'd spend hours drawing shadows under chairs just to see how light bent around them. His teachers said he had the patience of a monk and the stubbornness of a mathematician. By the time he entered the École des Beaux-Arts, Seurat realized something unsettling. Art, for all its beauty, was sloppy, too emotional, too human. The Impressionists were waving their brushes like magicians. But Seurat wanted formulas, not feelings. He wanted order, harmony, precision. And so he began an obsession. Imagine him alone in his studio, candlelight flickering on sketches covered in tiny marks, red beside blue beside yellow, each one carefully placed, each one a piece of a greater plan. His friends thought he'd lost it. George, you can't build colour like architecture, they said. But he could. He would. He devoured scientific studies about optics and colour theory. Chevreul, Rude, and Helmholtz became his secret companions. These weren't artists. They were scientists who studied how the human eye blends light. Seurat read their work like scripture. He began to believe that a painter could orchestrate colour the way a composer orchestrates sound. That red and green could vibrate like violin and cello. One of his sketchbooks shows hundreds of tiny swatches, combinations of colour dots that shimmered and pulsed when viewed from a distance. It looked less like art and more like code, a secret language of light. Historians still debate whether Seurat was truly guided by science or whether he just borrowed its vocabulary to justify instinct. Either way, his canvases began to glow with an eerie precision. He was in his early 20s when he started dreaming of something monumental, a painting that would embody his entire theory, a manifesto in dots. While his friends painted fleeting clouds, he envisioned a Sunday afternoon so still, so balanced, it could last forever. The world around him was changing fast. Paris was rebuilding itself, new boulevards, electric lights, and crowds seeking leisure along the Seine. Modern life had rhythm now, scheduled trains, mechanical clocks, uniform days off. Seurat wanted to paint that rhythm, not its emotion but its geometry, the pulse of order beneath chaos. In 1884, he began sketching what would become a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. At first, no one took it seriously. Who spends 2 years painting tiny dots on a canvas the size of a wall? But Seurat did. Day after day, he returned to his easel, laying one point beside another, millions of them, until the dots began to breathe, merge, and shimmer. From a distance, it looked like sunlight dancing on the river. Up close, it was pure calculation, each colour, each shadow chosen with near mathematical care. His contemporaries whispered that he'd gone mad with precision. But when La Grande Jatte was finally unveiled, the whispers turned to gasps. It wasn't impressionism anymore. It was something colder, sharper, eerily timeless. People didn't know what to make of it. Was it emotionless, mechanical, or had Seurat actually captured something beyond emotion, a universal rhythm that binds everything from colour to life itself? That's the paradox of Seurat, a man who sought control but ended up creating magic, a scientist with the soul of a poet. And though he never said it outright, perhaps he believed that beauty didn't live in chaos or passion, but in the quiet certainty of order. Art historians still argue whether Seurat's dots were a triumph of science or a failure of warmth, but one thing's for sure. He dared to ask a question no one else had. What if art could be built molecule by molecule, colour by colour, until it touched the very essence of light? And in that question, a movement was born. Paris, 1884. The air smelled of oil paint and rebellion. Georges Seurat, now in his mid-20s, was quietly orchestrating a revolution, one dot at a time, while his contemporaries dashed colour across the canvas with wild abandon. Seurat was plotting chromatic equations. The Impressionists wanted emotion, Seurat wanted order. It wasn't that he lacked feeling, he just believed emotion could be engineered. After the lukewarm reception of bathers at Asnières, Seurat began planning something monumental, something that would silence every critic who said he was too cerebral. He wanted to paint a world so meticulously structured, so mathematically balanced, that it would feel eternal. And out of that ambition was born a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. Picture this: a riverbank bathed in warm sunlight, Parisians dressed in their Sunday best, each frozen in timeless leisure. At first glance, it's peaceful. People strolling, chatting, maybe flirting beneath parasols. But look closer and the scene vibrates. The grass isn't green, it's thousands of microdots of blue and yellow. The shadows shimmer with purples and reds. Nothing is solid, yet everything feels anchored. It's as if Seurat reprogrammed light itself. He spent 2 years painting it, 2 years, during which he was so obsessed with precision that friends joked he probably measured his coffee by wavelength. But Seurat didn't just paint, he constructed. He carefully mapped every figure's position, ensuring perfect compositional harmony, so much that the painting's geometry could rival a symphony score. Art historians still argue whether La Grande Jatte is a masterpiece of logic or a prison of perfection. One scholar once described it as emotion under a microscope. Yet that's exactly what made it hypnotic. Seurat believed that art, like music, could be built upon rhythm and tone, a theory later dubbed neo-impressionism. He wanted viewers to feel colour like notes in a chord. And here's a strange little fact. Seurat didn't just study pigments, he studied optics. He devoured the works of scientists like Ogden Rood, who explained how complementary colours intensified one another. So when you look at that woman's orange dress against the blue Seine, your brain does half the painting for him. That's the trick. Your eyes are his co-conspirators. When he finally unveiled La Grande Jatte in 1886, the audience didn't know what hit them. Some critics called it the frozen apocalypse of Impressionism. Others, more generous, compared it to stained glass, rigid, luminous, sacred. One newspaper even said, "This is painting done by a mathematician who has lost his mind." Seurat, as usual, didn't reply. He preferred his dots to do the talking. Yet, amid the chaos of opinions, something extraordinary happened. Younger artists were intrigued. Paul Signac, a fiery, eloquent painter with an anarchist's heart, saw genius in Seurat's method. He became Seurat's most loyal ally, eventually coining the term divisionism to describe their scientific approach to colour. The two became the yin and yang of the movement, Seurat the thinker, Signac the evangelist. By 1887, Seurat's studio had become a kind of quiet laboratory. He tested colour juxtapositions, experimented with line direction to evoke emotions, horizontal for calm, diagonal for tension, vertical for grandeur. He even developed a theory of chromoluminarism, the idea that pure colours could generate light without white pigment. Academic, yes, but also strangely poetic. And while Seurat appeared calm on the surface, friends noted his intensity bordered on obsession. He'd refuse to go out, sometimes working in silence for hours, barely moving except to change brushes. His mother worried. His colleagues admired him. The only thing louder than his focus was the ticking of his clock. There's still debate about the hidden meanings in La Grande Jatte. Some scholars argue it's a social satire, a critique of bourgeois leisure. Others think Seurat was simply exploring how colour could organise chaos. Either way, the painting marked a point of no return. Pointillism wasn't just a style, it was a manifesto, emotion through precision, beauty through science. And while the world mocked, the future took notes. Picasso, Matisse, and even Kandinsky would later study Seurat's colour logic. Graphic design, animation, even pixel art owe him a debt. The man literally anticipated the digital age with nothing but a brush and patience. By the late 1880s, Seurat had become a quiet enigma in the Paris art scene, rarely speaking, rarely smiling, always observing. Some called him cold, but that wasn't fair. Beneath that meticulous calm burned a restlessness, a yearning to find beauty that could last beyond the fleeting light of Impressionism. As the sun set on the island of La Grande Jatte, Seurat had changed painting forever. He didn't just capture a moment, he engineered eternity. By the late 1880s, Georges Seurat had firmly established himself as both a revolutionary and a mystery. While the Impressionists had captured fleeting moments of light and leisure, Seurat was turning painting into a laboratory. Every canvas became a test of human perception, every dot a carefully calculated experiment. Paris, meanwhile, was changing too, streets bustling with gas lamps, cafes brimming with ideas, and the Seine reflecting a city that was modernizing faster than anyone could keep up with. Seurat was obsessed with color theory. He meticulously studied the works of Michel-Eugène Chevreul, Ogden Rood, and other scientists who investigated the behavior of colors when placed side by side. Their studies demonstrated that our eyes blend separate colors into new shades, an effect Seurat harnessed with breathtaking precision. He called this divisionism, though many today refer to it as pointillism. Yet, in his mind, the term was insufficient. It was more than technique. It was an ideology of light and vision. He began experimenting with brushstroke and dot placement. Horizontal dots suggested calm and stability. Verticals implied dignity, and diagonals created tension. Even the spaces between dots were deliberate. A gap could generate the illusion of shimmer or depth. Seurat approached painting with the meticulous care of a mathematician, often sketching grids to plot out his compositions long before the first color touched the canvas. The artist was also inspired by optical theories that had more in common with physics than traditional art. For example, complementary colors, like red and green or blue and orange, intensified each other when positioned side by side. This gave his paintings a vibrancy that seemed impossible, as if light itself were constructed pixel by pixel. It's no wonder that many contemporaries thought his work cold or mechanical. Some critics even questioned whether it was art at all. Art historians continue to debate this today. Was Seurat a visionary or a scientist masquerading as a painter? During this period, Seurat's studio became a peculiar sort of laboratory. He would mix pigments with extreme care, sometimes testing small patches on paper before committing them to canvas. Friends who visited noted that he rarely spoke of anything but his experiments. Some said he was socially awkward, others simply found his focus intimidating. Yet beneath the discipline was a quiet, poetic ambition to make the fleeting eternal. Seurat's next masterpiece, The Models, Les Poseuses, exemplified this obsession. He painted 3 female models repeatedly, each time experimenting with light, shadow, and color combinations. The resulting triptych was less about narrative and more about study, a meticulous mapping of form and perception. Some contemporaries found it tedious, others saw it as a profound exploration of human vision. Scholars today still argue over its intention. Was it a comment on labor, a study of form, or merely the byproduct of a meticulous mind? There were lighter, almost humorous aspects to his work. He reportedly once told a friend that a misplaced dot could ruin the symphony of a painting, a remark that sounded dramatic but reflected the precision behind his process. And yet, despite this meticulousness, his work was not devoid of life. Figures in La Grande Jatte and the models appear frozen yet vibrant, serene yet dynamic, living paradoxes constructed from tiny, deliberate points of color. In parallel, Seurat began to interact more with younger artists drawn to his methods. Paul Signac, for instance, became an enthusiastic disciple. Unlike Seurat, Signac embraced color with expressive freedom, blending scientific rigor with romantic flourish. Their friendship helped spread the principles of divisionism beyond Seurat's small private circle. Yet there was tension. Seurat remained solitary, devoted to calculation and order, while Signac often advocated for emotion and bold experimentation. This contrast highlighted one of the central debates of the era. Can rationality coexist with emotion in art? Scholars still argue about where Seurat himself stood on that spectrum. Outside the studio, Seurat was quietly observant. He enjoyed the serenity of the Paris parks, often sketching passers-by and studying how light fell across faces and clothing. He was particularly fascinated by bourgeois leisure, the Sunday afternoons, promenades and parks. Some suggest that his meticulous observation bordered on social critique, capturing the rigidity of modern life while presenting it in an almost hypnotic, static beauty. By this time, Seurat's reputation had grown among avant-garde circles, yet he remained relatively unknown to the wider public. Critics were divided, some admiring the brilliance and others ridiculing the apparent sterility. His influence, however, was quietly spreading. Young artists experimented with dots, lines, and complementary colors, and the seeds of neo-impressionism were firmly planted. Perhaps the most striking element of Seurat's practice was the patience it demanded. He reportedly spent weeks determining the precise color combination for a single shadow. While his peers chased immediacy, he sought permanence, and in doing so, he redefined what a painting could be. Not merely a window into a scene, but a carefully orchestrated interaction between human perception and visual reality. Even now, art historians debate his ultimate legacy. Was he primarily a scientist, a visionary, or a poet in disguise? Whatever the answer, Seurat's work from this period demonstrated a commitment to both observation and invention, blending the rigorous with the imaginative, the analytical with the aesthetic, a combination that would leave a lasting mark on modern art. By the early 1890s, Georges Seurat had moved from theory to practice in a way that astonished his contemporaries. While previous sections introduced his fascination with color theory, optics, and divisionism, this chapter dives into how he applied those ideas in actual compositions, and how those compositions began to define a new era of art. Unlike Impressionists who painted quickly to capture transient effects, Seurat treated the canvas as a stage, plotting figures and light with geometric precision. His works became laboratories where every dot, every shadow, every reflected highlight was carefully measured and meticulously placed. His breakthrough at this time was refining the techniques first seen in bathers at Asnières and expanded dramatically in La Grande Jatte. Seurat began to develop a rhythmic system, assigning emotional values to lines and shapes. Horizontal lines suggested calm serenity, vertical lines conveyed dignity, and diagonal compositions implied motion or tension. Unlike in earlier works, these elements were no longer subtle. They were the backbone of the visual narrative. This method allowed him to orchestrate both color and form, producing an overall harmony that some critics described as almost musical. Yet, as with all revolutionary ideas, not everyone appreciated it. Some contemporaries called his paintings cold or mechanical, a perception that lingers in certain art circles to this day. During this period, Seurat continued to experiment with small, almost obsessive details. For instance, he paid intense attention to the exact hue of a single shadow, blending complementary colors in tiny dots that interacted optically rather than physically on the canvas. This technique made the painted surface appear to vibrate with life, yet it remained constructed and deliberate. Scholars have debated whether this method made his art emotionally distant or whether the apparent coldness was an intentional contrast to the warmth of his subject matter. A particularly intriguing case is the models, Les Poseuses, a triptych that captured women posing in a studio. Unlike traditional narrative paintings, this work focused on repetition and study rather than storytelling. Seurat painted each pose multiple times, experimenting with light, shade, and color interactions. Some critics interpreted the triptych as a meditation on labor, while others believed it was a meticulous exploration of visual perception. The debate persists today, demonstrating the enduring complexity of Seurat's intent. Seurat's personal life remained largely private, though glimpses of tenderness emerged in anecdotes from friends. He was reportedly devoted to close companions and extremely methodical in daily habits. A curious fact, he would reportedly label his brushes with numbers corresponding to their size and intended use for each project, ensuring absolute consistency across paintings. This level of detail extended to his palette, where pigments were tested repeatedly for purity and optical effect. By this stage, Seurat had also influenced a circle of younger artists, most notably Paul Signac. Signac admired Seurat's rigor but infused his own work with more expressive color, demonstrating that the principles of divisionism could coexist with personal flair. The two artists, in a sense, represented complementary extremes. Seurat, the meticulous theorist, Signac, the exuberant advocate. Their relationship exemplified a dynamic tension within the emerging neo-impressionist movement between control and spontaneity. Another lesser-known aspect of this period is Seurat's occasional engagement with architecture and urban design concepts. He would sketch cityscapes, parks, and promenades with an almost schematic approach, as if anticipating modernist planning techniques. Observers noted that his compositions often resembled aerial diagrams, revealing an interest not only in color but also in spatial organization and human behavior within structured environments. This interplay between art, science, and social observation underscores the multidisciplinary nature of his vision. Critics remain divided, of course. Some argued that Seurat's obsessive precision stripped paintings of life, reducing them to exercises in calculation. Others praised his ability to elevate the visual experience into a higher, almost philosophical plane. Scholars today still debate whether Seurat's work prioritized aesthetic experience or intellectual order, and perhaps the answer lies somewhere between both poles. During these years, Seurat also explored more public themes, depicting leisure scenes in parks and on riverbanks that were immediately recognizable to contemporary audiences. Yet the real innovation lay in his treatment of color, light, and space. Shadows were no longer simply darkened areas. They became compositions of color dots interacting in ways that produced optical brilliance. Light was structured, intentional, almost like a character within the painting itself. By the end of this period, Seurat's reputation had solidified within avant-garde circles, and his methods inspired debates about the nature of modern art. Divisionism was no longer just a technical experiment. It had become a philosophical statement. Beauty could be orchestrated with precision, and the artist could simultaneously satisfy reason and imagination. While public reception varied, and while critics still questioned the emotional resonance of his work, one thing was certain: Seurat had created a methodology capable of influencing generations. By the mid-1890s, Georges Seurat had reached the peak of his public recognition, yet his work remained enigmatic. While sections 2 through 4 focused on his early experimentation, color theory, and methodical composition, this chapter examines the culmination of his ambitions in a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, a painting that would define not only his career but also the trajectory of neo-impressionism. Unlike his earlier works, which were experimental studies or smaller compositions, La Grande Jatte was monumental both in scale and impact, stretching over 10 feet in width and inviting viewers to lose themselves in its meticulous world. Seurat approached the canvas with scientific rigor. Every figure, every shadow, every splash of light was carefully plotted. He used a combination of grids and preliminary sketches to ensure compositional balance. The painting depicted Parisians enjoying a leisurely Sunday on an island in the Seine, yet beneath its serene surface lay a structure so precise that it almost resembled architecture. The subtle placement of each figure created a rhythmic flow, guiding the viewer's eye through a carefully orchestrated dance of light, form, and color. The use of color in La Grande Jatte exemplified Seurat's mastery of divisionism. Complementary hues were placed side by side in tiny dots, allowing the viewer's eye to mix them optically. The grass, for instance, was not a uniform green, but a combination of yellow, blue, and tiny red dots, producing an impression of vibrancy and depth. Shadows were similarly constructed from layered colors, challenging traditional notions of light and volume. Art historians continue to debate whether the painting's effect is more analytical than emotional, a discussion that reflects the tension between Seurat's intellectual precision and the impressionist legacy he built upon. One curious detail of the painting involves the figures themselves. Seurat arranged them in rigid postures, almost as if frozen in a formal tableau, yet each character exudes individuality through subtle gestures and positioning. Some scholars suggest this was Seurat's way of critiquing bourgeois leisure. Others argue it simply demonstrates his interest in systematic composition. The ambiguity adds to the painting's enduring fascination and fuels ongoing scholarly debate. The impact of La Grande Jatte on Seurat's contemporaries was profound. Critics were divided, with some dismissing the work as mechanical or overly controlled, while others marveled at its visual harmony and technical innovation. Fellow artists, particularly Paul Signac, were captivated and began to adopt and expand upon Seurat's methods. Divisionism began to evolve into a broader movement, influencing artists across Europe and laying the foundation for subsequent experiments in color theory and modernist abstraction. Seurat's working methods during this period were as meticulous as ever. He tested pigments in small squares to determine optical effects, measured distances to achieve compositional balance, and even experimented with the psychological impact of colors. A lesser-known anecdote recounts that he sometimes placed mirrors at different angles to examine how reflected light altered the appearance of his dots. This obsessive attention to detail exemplifies both his genius and his unique approach to painting, blending scientific investigation with artistic intuition. While the painting is often seen as a static, formal composition, its creation involved dynamic problem-solving. Seurat had to balance human figures, trees, reflections in the water, and the play of sunlight, all while maintaining optical harmony. The result was a visual symphony where color, form, and space intermingled in a controlled yet vibrant rhythm. It remains one of the most celebrated examples of neo-impressionist technique, demonstrating that careful planning and aesthetic vision can coexist. Interestingly, Seurat's personal life during this time remained largely private. He avoided social gatherings, preferring the solitude of his studio to cafes or salons. Friends noted his meticulous nature extended beyond painting to everyday habits, such as arranging brushes and pigments with numerical precision. This dedication, bordering on obsessive, underscored his commitment to realizing a theory of visual harmony that could be both studied and felt. Despite his seclusion, Seurat's influence continued to spread. Students and admirers began to experiment with divisionist techniques, applying the principles of color interaction and optical blending to their own works. Signac, in particular, championed Seurat's innovations and helped codify the movement's methodology, ensuring that the intellectual and aesthetic contributions of pointillism would endure beyond the artist's own lifetime. In summary, La Grande Jatte represents both a culmination of Seurat's early explorations and a launching point for broader artistic developments. It synthesizes his meticulous approach, his scientific study of color, and his desire to impose order on the fleeting chaos of modern life. The painting stands as a testament to his vision, illustrating how methodical construction, innovative technique, and subtle emotion can coexist on a monumental scale. It's a work that continues to inspire, challenge, and provoke discussion, solidifying Seurat's position in the pantheon of modern art. Following the monumental success of La Grande Jatte, Georges Seurat continued to explore the possibilities of neo-impressionism, but now with an increasing interest in the rhythm and structure of composition. While sections 2 through 5 covered his development of divisionism, early studies, and the creation of La Grande Jatte, this chapter focuses on how Seurat refined his technique, experimented with new subject matter, and navigated the complex social and artistic networks of Paris in the late 1880s and early 1890s. Seurat began to investigate not just parks and riverbanks, but also more dynamic urban scenes. One of his notable works from this period is the circus, Le Cirque, which captures performers and spectators in a dazzling arena of movement. Unlike the calm, almost frozen figures of La Grande Jatte, here energy and motion are central. Yet even in this lively setting, every brushstroke and dot is calculated. Each figure's pose, each shadow, and even the placement of the ropes and lights was designed to orchestrate visual harmony. Scholars still debate whether the painting emphasizes spectacle or the psychology of the crowd, a tension that reflects Seurat's dual commitment to precision and perception. Seurat's dedication to optical experimentation intensified. He tested subtle variations of complementary colors to convey both light and emotional nuance. For instance, the red and green tones in the circus interact to suggest warmth and excitement, while the blues and oranges provide balance and depth. It's a technique that requires viewers to engage actively. The eye fuses separate points of pigment into a cohesive whole, and the brain completes the illusion. This interplay between perception and composition was at the core of Seurat's artistic philosophy. During this time, Seurat also explored more formalized compositional strategies. He began using grids and geometric guides with even greater rigor, treating the canvas as an architectural blueprint. Figures and objects were not simply placed for aesthetic appeal. They were positioned to create balance and visual rhythm, a principle sometimes referred to as chromatic architecture. This approach influenced later artists who sought order within modernity's chaos. Art historians continue to discuss whether Seurat's rigid structure enhanced the emotional impact of his works or constrained it. On a personal level, Seurat remained a reserved and disciplined figure. Unlike many of his contemporaries who thrived on social interaction, he preferred solitude, spending hours in his studio perfecting minute details. A quirky fact from this period: he reportedly used tiny magnifying glasses to check the precision of his dots, ensuring that even the smallest mark contributed to the optical effect. This obsessive attention to detail bordered on ritual, underscoring his belief that painting was a science as much as an art. Seurat's influence among fellow artists grew steadily. Paul Signac continued to champion divisionism, while younger painters experimented with color separation and optical effects. Even Claude Monet and other impressionists took note, acknowledging the intellectual rigor of Seurat's methods, though they maintained their preference for more spontaneous approaches. The tension between freedom and structure became a defining debate of the era, illustrating the broader challenge of reconciling emotion with method in modern art. Interestingly, Seurat also experimented with unconventional subjects and formats during this period. In works like Young Woman Powdering Herself, Jeune Femme Se Poudrant, he explored intimate, everyday moments with the same meticulous divisionist technique used in his large-scale compositions. The contrast between private subjects and public grandeur reveals a complex artist, simultaneously rigorous and attentive to the subtleties of human experience. Scholars still argue about the social commentary embedded in these paintings, whether Seurat intended critique, observation, or pure aesthetic experimentation. His late 1880s and early 1890s works also demonstrate his fascination with spatial perception. Seurat often created subtle optical illusions of depth and volume, achieved entirely through dot placement and color contrast. Unlike traditional perspective, which relied on linear techniques, Seurat's method manipulated light and hue to guide the viewer's gaze naturally across the canvas. This innovation foreshadowed developments in abstraction and influenced artists well into the 20th century. By the end of this period, Seurat had firmly established a style that married science, observation, and visual poetry. He remained methodical and introverted, yet the breadth of his work, spanning public leisure, urban spectacle, and private moments, revealed a mind deeply attuned to both structure and sensation. His influence on the emerging neo-impressionist movement was profound, setting a template for technical rigor and thoughtful composition that would ripple through art history for decades. As the 1890s progressed, Georges Seurat's influence continued to extend beyond the confines of the studio into the broader art world. While earlier sections detailed his meticulous divisionist techniques, early experiments, and major compositions like La Grande Jatte and The Circus, this chapter focuses on the subtler, often overlooked contributions Seurat made to the evolution of modern visual culture, particularly in his exploration of pattern, rhythm, and the psychological effects of color. Seurat's fascination with rhythm and composition was not limited to large-scale public scenes. He increasingly focused on smaller, intimate studies that allowed him to explore subtler visual interactions. In works such as The Models, Les Poseuses, he repeated figures and poses, experimenting with variations in light, shadow, and color. Each dot, meticulously applied, contributed to a visual cadence that could be read almost like a musical score. Scholars continue to debate whether Seurat was seeking narrative meaning or purely formal aesthetic harmony. The ambiguity has made these works enduring subjects of fascination. During this period, Seurat also paid closer attention to social spaces and human behavior. He sketched crowds, promenades, and leisure scenes, observing posture, gaze, and interaction. In these studies, he applied divisionist principles not just for optical effect, but to create a sense of order and rhythm within society itself. Some art historians argue that these works subtly critique bourgeois conventions, while others maintain they are simply exercises in structural observation. The debate remains unresolved, reflecting the layered complexity of Seurat's vision. An interesting, lesser-known detail about Seurat's methodology during this time is his experimental use of optical vibration. He would place complementary colors, such as red and green or blue and orange, side by side in tiny dots to create the perception of movement or shimmering light. This technique, now a hallmark of pointillism, allowed static subjects to appear alive, as if vibrating under the viewer's gaze. Seurat's notebooks suggest he considered these effects carefully, almost like a scientist conducting controlled experiments, blending empirical observation with aesthetic intuition. Seurat also explored the interaction between color, line, and geometry in a more theoretical sense. He mapped compositions according to harmonic principles, assigning emotional and visual weight to positions, orientations, and shapes. Horizontal lines suggested calmness, vertical lines implied dignity, and diagonal orientations created tension or motion. While this system enhanced compositional balance, it also led some critics to view his work as overly cerebral or formulaic. Even today, debates continue about whether Seurat's scientific rigor enhanced the expressive potential of his paintings or limited it. Meanwhile, Seurat's engagement with other artists continued to shape the neo-impressionist movement. Paul Signac remained his closest collaborator, promoting divisionist principles with a more expressive, less restrained approach. Younger painters experimented with optical blending, color separation, and structured composition, often referencing Seurat's notebooks or public exhibitions. This dialogue between rigor and spontaneity contributed to the richness of late 19th century avant-garde art, demonstrating how a single artist's method could influence an entire generation. Seurat also demonstrated a subtle humor in his work, though it was rarely obvious at first glance. He enjoyed placing figures in poses that suggested both formality and whimsy, creating slight tension between the structure of his method and the life of his subjects. For example, in some riverbank scenes, carefully plotted groups of figures seemed stiff, yet small gestures, a tilted head, a raised parasol, introduced unexpected liveliness. This interplay between control and vitality remains a distinctive feature of his mature work. During these years, Seurat became increasingly interested in the relationship between painting and the viewer's perception. His approach relied on the idea that the observer completes the work. Dots of color blend in the eye. Rhythmic arrangements guide attention, and subtle contrasts evoke emotion. In this sense, Seurat was anticipating ideas that would later influence optical art, color theory and design, and even aspects of visual psychology. Scholars still debate the extent to which he consciously theorized these perceptual effects versus discovering them intuitively through practice. By the end of this period, Seurat's oeuvre was both technically innovative and intellectually provocative. He had established a visual language of points, color, and rhythm that allowed him to explore modern life with precision, yet also invited viewers to participate actively in the creation of aesthetic experience. While some contemporaries found his work austere, others celebrated its rigor, harmony, and capacity to evoke subtle emotion. Seurat had created a bridge between scientific observation and visual poetry, a foundation that would influence artists and designers for decades to come. By the mid-1890s, Georges Seurat had firmly established his position as the intellectual leader of neo-impressionism, yet his ambitions were evolving in new directions. While previous sections detailed his early experiments, divisionist techniques, and major public works, This chapter examines his increasingly sophisticated exploration of light, movement, and social commentary, as well as his influence on the next generation of artists and designers. Seurat's later works focused heavily on the interplay of light and structure. Unlike Impressionists who chased the ephemeral glow of changing daylight, Seurat approached light as a system to be understood, measured, and orchestrated. He meticulously applied divisionist principles, layering complementary colors to produce subtle luminosity and controlled vibrancy. A single shadow, composed of thousands of minuscule dots, could suggest both depth and emotion. Scholars continue to debate whether his methodical use of light enhanced the painting's psychological resonance or rendered it overly calculated. One of his key projects during this period was the models Les Poseuses, which exemplified his commitment to studying human form, spatial arrangement, and chromatic relationships. Repeating poses allowed him to experiment with the effects of light and color on perception. The triptych format also encouraged viewers to compare and contrast subtle differences, highlighting Seurat's interest in both formal aesthetics and perceptual science. This approach sparked ongoing discussion among art historians. Was Seurat aiming for social commentary, aesthetic perfection, or both? Seurat also experimented with more dynamic urban subject matter. He sketched crowds in parks, promenades, and theatres, observing human interaction with meticulous care. In these studies, each figure's position and gesture contributed to the overall rhythm of the composition. Small, seemingly mundane details, a parasol at a slight angle, a child reaching for a toy, were intentionally placed to guide the viewer's eye and evoke a sense of controlled vitality. This balance of structure and life became a hallmark of his mature style. A lesser-known but fascinating aspect of this period is Seurat's application of mathematical principles to composition. He often plotted points and lines according to ratios derived from classical harmony, believing that visual proportions could produce aesthetic pleasure analogous to musical chords. He even recorded calculations for dot placement and color blending, demonstrating his unique fusion of art and science. Some scholars have suggested that these experiments foreshadowed concepts in modern graphic design and digital visualizations. Socially, Seurat remained introverted, dedicating most of his time to studio work. Friends and fellow artists noticed his almost ritualistic routines, meticulously organizing pigments, arranging brushes by size and purpose, and conducting tests to predict optical interactions. One anecdote recounts that he sometimes adjusted the lighting in his studio to mimic different times of day, allowing him to observe subtle changes in color perception. This dedication reinforced his belief that painting was both intellectual inquiry and poetic expression. Seurat's influence during this period extended beyond his own works. Paul Signac and other neo-impressionists embraced divisionism while exploring new applications in color, form, and public exhibition. Artists began to recognize that Seurat's methods could be adapted to diverse subjects, from landscapes to urban scenes, intimate portraits to theatrical spectacles, without losing the underlying principles of optical harmony and rhythm. Yet, debates persisted about whether the system's rigor enhanced or constrained artistic expression. In addition to visual art, Seurat's ideas subtly impacted design thinking. His attention to color interaction, spatial rhythm, and optical perception influenced emerging fields such as poster design and stage set composition. Some design historians even trace early pixel-based concepts in digital art to the divisionist techniques pioneered by Seurat, highlighting the lasting relevance of his experiments. By the late 1890s, Seurat had become both revered and enigmatic. He was celebrated for technical innovation and meticulous craftsmanship, yet some contemporaries and later critics argued that his work prioritized method over spontaneity. Despite these tensions, his legacy was secure. He had expanded the possibilities of visual language, combining science, perception, and aesthetic intuition in ways that reshaped the landscape of modern art. By the late 1890s, Georges Seurat's influence had begun to extend well beyond painting, as artists, critics, and designers increasingly engaged with his theories on color, perception, and composition. While earlier sections traced his development from experimental divisionism to major works like La Grande Jatte and the Circus, this chapter explores Seurat's broader legacy, his impact on neo-impressionism, early modern design, and the conceptualization of art as both science and poetry. Seurat's mature works reveal a unique interplay between structure and subtle emotional expression. Even in seemingly static compositions, tiny variations in dot placement and color interactions created optical vibrations, imbuing scenes with energy. For instance, in his later studies of riverbanks, parks, and promenades, ordinary leisure activities appear infused with rhythm and harmony. Critics at the time were divided. Some praised the controlled beauty, while others dismissed it as overly cerebral. This tension between analytical rigor and aesthetic vitality remains a central topic in art historical debate. One fascinating aspect of Seurat's work during this period is his systematic approach to human anatomy and gesture. He frequently sketched repeated poses, experimenting with proportions, angles, and posture to determine their visual effect within a grid-based composition. The repetition allowed him to explore nuanced interactions between figures and their environment, ensuring that each dot contributed to both structural order and perceptual impact. Scholars still debate whether this method prioritized scientific observation over human expressiveness, highlighting the persistent ambiguity in Seurat's intent. Seurat's impact on other artists also intensified during these years. Paul Signac embraced the principles of divisionism but adapted them for more expressive effect, blending precise color theory with personal flair. Younger artists experimented with optical blending, complementary colors, and rhythmic composition, building on Seurat's technical foundations while exploring emotional resonance. The dialogue between meticulous methodology and expressive experimentation shaped the emerging neo-impressionist movement, ensuring that Seurat's innovations resonated far beyond his immediate circle. An often overlooked facet of Seurat's practice was his attention to spatial organization. He treated the canvas as a microcosm of ordered space, where light, color, and geometry interacted to guide the viewer's eye. Some of his sketches resemble diagrams, mapping out proportions and relative positions of figures, trees, and architectural elements. This concern with spatial harmony foreshadowed developments in modernist design and urban planning, demonstrating the interdisciplinary potential of his approach. Seurat's dedication to precision also extended to the minutiae of studio practice. He meticulously labeled pigments, experimented with dot size and density, and occasionally used magnifying lenses to observe subtle interactions. Anecdotes suggest he adjusted studio lighting to replicate natural sunlight at various times of day, testing how perception shifted with illumination. These practices reveal an artist deeply engaged with the mechanics of seeing, blending technical inquiry with artistic sensibility. In addition, Seurat's work began to influence design and decorative arts. Posters, theatre sets, and early graphic design borrowed from divisionist principles, applying concepts of colour vibration and spatial rhythm to new media. Some historians argue that Seurat's methods anticipated elements of digital visual culture, where pixel-based composition and optical blending echo the principles he pioneered. Despite his growing recognition, Seurat's personal life remained largely private. He avoided social scenes, devoting himself to observation and study. Yet his work demonstrated both intellectual depth and subtle poetic sensibility, balancing mathematical precision with human nuance. Even in stillness, his paintings convey motion, emotion, and optical brilliance, a testament to his ability to merge science and art. By the end of this period, Seurat had solidified a legacy that transcended his individual works. His explorations in colour, perception, and structured composition influenced generations of painters, designers, and theorists. While debates persist about the relative weight of method versus spontaneity in his art, there is no question that his ideas reshaped modern visual culture, laying the foundation for a century of innovation. As the century drew to a close, Georges Seurat's vision had firmly cemented itself in the fabric of modern art, leaving an indelible mark that extended far beyond his own canvases. While previous sections chronicled his meticulous experiments, major works, and influence on neo-impressionism and early design, this final chapter examines Seurat's enduring legacy, his posthumous reputation, and the subtle ways his innovations reverberated through 20th century art movements and visual culture. Seurat's untimely death in 1891 at the age of 31 left a relatively small body of work, yet its impact was disproportionately large. Artists, critics, and theorists recognized that his rigorous application of divisionist principles offered a new lens through which to understand visual perception, composition, and color. While the Impressionists had captured fleeting moments of light and atmosphere, Seurat proposed a system that combined optical science with artistic expression, demonstrating that paintings could be both intellectually precise and visually poetic. Scholars continue to debate the balance between analytical method and emotive content in his work, a discussion that underscores the layered complexity of his legacy. One of Seurat's most enduring contributions lies in the formalization of pointillism. By breaking down color into discrete dots, he allowed viewers' eyes to perform the final synthesis, effectively involving them in the act of creation. This approach influenced not only painters such as Signac and Cross, but also designers and illustrators who applied optical blending to printmaking, posters, and stage design. Remarkably, these principles anticipated aspects of digital imaging, where pixel-based composition mirrors Seurat's divisionist technique, highlighting his relevance to contemporary visual culture. Seurat's influence on subsequent avant-garde movements was equally significant. The structured color fields, rhythmic compositions, and interplay between light and geometry in his work prefigured developments in cubism, futurism, and even abstract expressionism. Artists like Mondrian and Delaunay explored the possibilities of color and form in ways that echoed Seurat's meticulous study of visual harmony. While they departed from his representational subjects, they retained his emphasis on optical interaction and systematic composition. Art historians still debate the extent to which these movements were direct extensions of Seurat's method versus independent explorations inspired by his ideas. A lesser-known aspect of Seurat's legacy is his subtle impact on urban and architectural design. His sketches of parks, promenades, and cityscapes reveal an analytical approach to human interaction within structured environments. The arrangement of figures, paths, and spatial relationships in his compositions influenced early landscape architects and planners who sought to harmonize human activity with visual order. Some contemporary scholars even argue that Seurat's meticulous diagrams foreshadowed modernist approaches to spatial design and public space planning. Seurat's posthumous reputation evolved in fascinating ways. During his lifetime, critics were divided. Some viewed his works as cold and overly calculated, while others praised their harmonic rigor. After his death, exhibitions and retrospectives cemented his place as a pioneering figure of modern art. Younger artists adopted and adapted his methods, and the principles of divisionism became embedded in art education and theory. Yet, even today, debates persist over whether his approach prioritized intellectual precision at the expense of emotional immediacy, a question that keeps his work perpetually engaging for scholars and enthusiasts alike. An intriguing detail of Seurat's method was his obsessive attention to detail. Beyond the studio, he applied systematic rigor to all aspects of creation. Pigments were tested for purity, brushes numbered and assigned for specific tasks, and studio lighting adjusted to observe optical effects under varying conditions. This near-scientific discipline allowed him to explore visual perception with unparalleled accuracy, creating a language of color and form that continues to inspire both analytical and expressive approaches in art. Seurat's impact on neo-impressionism and broader visual culture is now undeniable. By demonstrating how scientific observation and artistic intuition could coexist, he laid the groundwork for an art that was both measured and poetic, precise yet emotive. His work challenged artists to consider the mechanics of seeing and to experiment with color, light, and rhythm in ways that expanded the possibilities of representation. The movement he helped define evolved beyond him, but the principles he established remain central to the study of color theory and visual perception. In the final analysis, Seurat's legacy transcends any single painting. He established a methodology that blended intellect, perception, and emotion, creating a visual language capable of expressing both order and vitality. From La Grande Jatte to his smaller, intimate studies, from divisionist dots to spatial orchestration, Seurat demonstrated that art could be a rigorous inquiry and a poetic experience simultaneously. Scholars and artists continue to examine, reinterpret, and be inspired by his work, ensuring that his innovations endure far beyond the 19th century. Now, as we drift away from the intensity of Seurat's studio and the meticulous order of his compositions, imagine yourself on the quiet banks of the Seine at dusk. The air is soft, the colors of the evening blending slowly in your mind's eye. Tiny points of light shimmer on the water as if the world itself were painted in subtle dots, and each shadow stretches and yawns as the day surrenders to night. The rhythmic calm of Seurat's vision seems to pulse gently around you, and you feel the quiet pleasure of observation, the slow satisfaction of patterns settling into harmony. Your thoughts lighten, your eyes grow heavy, and the precise yet poetic world of color and rhythm fades into a gentle dreamscape. The images linger just long enough for your imagination to carry them into sleep, and for a few moments you are suspended in the serene beauty of a world ordered by both intellect and artistry. Let yourself float here softly, easily, and let the quiet of night embrace you.